lost access to the lobby, so I may need to let some people in. But
much for having me. The title of the talk is Application of Patient-Reported Outcomes in Patient-Focused Drug Development and in Clinical Monitoring to Optimize Patient Management. And I'll try to cover that in some broad ways and stuff that I hope is relevant in trials and in clinic directly as well. Please do jump in and interrupt if you have a question or thoughts or et cetera. I'd love to have conversation. So just a very short background on the format of the talk. I'll start with a very brief introduction about myself, then look at patient-focused drug development, medicinal or drug review really is what I'm focused on. And then an area where I focus a lot is assessing adverse events from a patient's perspective using PROs. Then I'll move on to looking at use of PROs and real-world evidence generation and try to bring that together about how we can capture PROs in clinic around adverse events, in particular for real-world evidence generation. So just a bit about me. I'm a PRO researcher. I started out as more of a psychometrician and focusing on validating and developing PROs. I still do quite a bit of that, but less on the analysis side and more sort of leading projects in that vein, although I am still working PRO methods a bit. Joined the faculty of Northwestern's Department of Medical Social Sciences in 2018, where I did a lot of work in this space around PRO development, especially in the context of implementation and trials. And so name you may or may not have heard, David Sella is a person in this area who's done a lot in RCC, and so he's primary mentor, I would say, of my career, and still collaborate with him quite a bit. About a year ago, a little less, I moved over to the UK, taking a role there to do very similar work, but internationally. I work in a group called the Center for Patient-Reported Outcomes Research that focuses across PROs and trials, applied PRO kind of methodological research and routine practice, and that group generated, prior to me coming, a number of seminal standards and methodological guidance for implementation around reporting and inclusion of PROs in trial protocols especially. And then I also am the deputy director for something called the Birmingham Health Partners Center for Regulatory Science and Innovation, and so really sort of trying to advance this ability to use PROs in regulatory decision making. At least that's my role in that. So let's get right into the meat here. So from use this term patient-focused drug development. So from the FDA's perspective, that is a systematic approach to help ensure patients' experiences, perspectives, and needs and priorities are captured meaningfully in the drug development and evaluation process. That can be expressed in a number of different ways. The area I've focused on the most is using PROs as endpoints in clinical trials to assist in drug labeling or maybe in rare cases approvals. And I think really what it's about is that we don't want to replace any of the traditional types of outcomes or even innovative other types of outcomes, biomarkers, et cetera, that have emerged across medicine. But we do want to complement that with aspects of how the patients feel and function. And in oncology, I think is a space where that's really well understood these days, and PRO tends to be a very frequent player in the drug development space. I should have mentioned as well that I have retained a role in ECOG Akron's group as the PRO chair of that in the States. So even though I'm based in the UK, I still work along the States. So this really came about, this sort of emphasis on patient-focused drug development in the U.S. as part of the 20th Century Cures Act, which really sprung into action in 2017, though it was signed at the end of 2016, where kind of by law we're meant to really be sort of looking at the patient's experience as a part of drug development. And that is around, according to that legislation, patient experience. And patient experience data is intended to provide information about patients' experiences with a disease or a condition, impact of that disease, or related therapy on patients' lives. And again, that can be using things like PROs, but it isn't limited to that, and there are a number of other ways to look at patients' experience as well. Drug development tools that's kind of a technical regulatory term from the FDA point of view. Again, mandated through the 21st Century Cures Act to be included, and that is sort of around methods, materials, and measures that can aid in drug development. Those aren't specific to PROs or patient-centered. There's all kinds of drug development tools, but this is sort of what is, from a regulatory point of view, how we sort of understand the impact of drugs more broadly and whether or not they work or are dangerous. And increasingly, from the FDA perspective, things like PROs, or what falls under clinical outcome assessments, are part of that drug development tool picture. And they even have a qualification program similar to a biomarker program, or you can qualify animal models as well. You can now qualify clinical outcome assessments, and that's clinical tools to measure patients' symptoms and overall mental state or effects of disease and condition on how the patient feels, or rather functions, and includes PROs. But PROs aren't the only type of patient-reported, the only type of clinical outcome assessment. You also have performance outcome measures. So we get a bit of this in oncology, where you have, say, physical function performance, like 6-minute walk test, or you have performance measures of cognitive function. You can also have observer-reported outcome measures, which are a bit like, but importantly not, proxy measures. And so, typically these would be used with, say, young children who are too young to report them for themselves, maybe below age 8, or it could be in other, populations like adults who for other reasons can't report directly for themselves. But the goal is not to try to report that person's experiences directly, but what can be observed. And so, can you observe something about a patient's physical function? Can you observe something about other elements of their experience? And so you can use an observer-reported outcome to do that. And also clinician-reported outcome measures fall under clinical outcome assessments. And so these are all different things that can be brought in and used together as an entire package of getting at the patient's experience. Although I would say PROs are at least to date, the most frequently typed of clinical outcome assessment employed. There's been pretty robust guidance published by the US FDA on how they want sponsors to select, include, analyze, and interpret these types of clinical outcome assessment endpoints in trials for the purpose of approvals or labels. And so FDA is really invested in this, and they have to be. And they've invested a lot and they have a division of clinical outcome assessments now. There are experts in this area who, when you try to submit this type of evidence with a drug submission, you have methodological experts who will be reviewing this as in addition to experts in the clinical areas of the drugs being submitted. And this, I think, has enriched drug development quite a bit over the last 10 years or so. Looking at, I mentioned there were there is an ability to submit for approval or qualification PROs or other clinical outcome assessments as drug development tools in the space. So the group I work with, and Dave Sellett has led both of these, I've worked with him closely, is working on 2 of these currently. They're somewhere in this process. One is a physical function measure coming from the PROMIS PRO system to get at physical functioning, of course, across different types of cancers, including both solid tumors and heme, and that's quite close to, I think, being approved. We hope we're almost done with that. Specific to renal cell carcinoma, we've been working with the FDA over a number of years to derive a kind of some questions from the FIXI measures, if you know those, and that's functional assessment of cancer therapy, disease-related symptoms, or kidney symptom index, disease-related symptoms is the specific focus of this submission. And that's less mature, I would say, and it's going through the process. But we are engaging and have engaged with the US FDA around RCC through this in particular. So I want to talk a little bit about the U.S. FDA's Oncology Center of Excellence, because it was also created by the 21st Century Cures Act. And I would say it's has a broad mandate to conduct a good review of medical products coming through related to oncology and hematological malignancies. But I would say it's kind of a leader within the FDA around patient-focused drug development. So you've had key figures within the OCE who have really been at the forefront of driving some of this stuff forward. And I can talk about that more specifically later in the talk. But I've had funding from the US FDA to support some of this stuff, and that's been related to the OCE sort of interest and missions around incorporating PROs in their reviews, and they've done that, and they continue to be. We all know that things are a little bit abnormal recently, but I would say they even through that have stayed quite focused on this area. And that is to some degree echoed internationally, where you've had people from Europe, as well as in Canada, publishing within the Lancet Oncology, so quite focused in oncology around the importance of bringing in patient-reported outcomes and other ways of capturing the patient's voice into regulatory decision-making. So I think this is a priority these days for regulators, especially within oncology. The Oncology Center of Excellence has published their own cancer-specific guidance around a core patient-reported outcome set for cancer clinical trials. This also features some other methodological guidance about assessment of PROs and other clinical outcome assessments in cancer trials. The final guidance was issued not quite a year ago. And one of the things it really did was introduce this core set of concepts of saying, here's the types of things you could measure around PRO concepts that we would like to see and might use in regulatory review. These are disease-related symptoms, symptomatic adverse events, measures of overall side effect impact. That would be different from symptomatic adverse events, where you might have some symptomatic adverse events would be, say, about neuropathy or about diarrhea or about something specifically. Overall side effects would be about sort of what's the overall impact of multiple toxicities. Physical function as well as role function being more of a look at how you can participate in meaningful aspects of your life. And examples of these in terms of specific PRO measures. So disease-related symptoms you might think about in terms of, again, this FACT kidney symptom index, which is not a single measure. It's more like a suite of measures of different lengths and slightly different content. But that really gets at sort of what is a symptomatic presentation and experience of people with kidney cancer. Symptomatic adverse events, so of course you have the PRO version of the CTCAE, which NCI, National Cancer Institute, published, and so really what they did was they looked at the CTCAE and they said, okay, what that's currently being measured in terms of adverse event grading is symptomatic and can be best rated by the patient. Let's have a PRO version of that. And so that's a big library of PRO questions or items that you could select from to include in a trial. Overall side effect impact summary, so you have a measure that's been used quite frequently, again from the FACT, functional assessment of cancer therapy system, called GP5, which was actually part of the original FACT-G, if you ever heard of that, and loads of trials. And this is one question: I'm bothered by side effects of treatment, and we'll look at that a bit more later, so I'll save some of that for a future part of this talk. Physical function, again, this is the PROMIS Physical Function 8C. That's the one we have under review and is hopefully quite close to being approved by the FDA to include in cancer trials. And then role function, PROMIS measurement system also has options to address that particular need. So these are not the only ways you can address these. I just want to give you some concrete examples to potentially look up. You could look to EORTC. You could look to a variety of sources to cover some of these same concepts. In cancer or kidney cancer trials, in particular, that FIXI set of measures has been prominent. And so I just wanted to show this. First one goes back to 2008, but all the way through 2018, I think this Cabo-Nivo trial was actually in 2016, a bit before that. Moving on from there, Nivo everolimus, and then just last year, looking at additional publications from Checkmate 214 trial. This particular measure has featured in lots and lots of kidney cancer drug evaluation. And even if there aren't labels emerging, I think it's been really informative in terms of trying to understand the patient's experience. And it's nice to have a single measure across all these different trials that you can then begin to compare across the trials in terms of how do patients do on one drug versus another, of course, assuming that other elements of the trial are comparable enough to do that. And really, I
Devin,
think
can I interrupt you with a question?
Sure, of
I was
course.
going to ask about that, this sort of comparing quality of life data I've always struggled with,
Yep.
in part because I think the questionnaires, I guess my non-expert opinion would be they capture quality of life, but not perfectly, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so if you're comparing trial A versus trial B, we're used to comparing response rate and PFS, which have their own pitfalls, of course, but seems a little more straightforward. But the reason I struggle is that sometimes you see the data, but for me, it doesn't match my real experience giving the regimen. So you see this data, oh, regimen A has way better quality of life than regimen B, but I've given plenty of both, and I might think the opposite or might think they're the same, and I don't know
That's
how you would
right.
respond to that, but that's always been my issue. Is like, well, when people stand up and say this regimen's better because of quality of life, I'm always a little skeptical.
Yeah, curious to hear more what your impressions of that are, because I would love, I'm not a clinician, so I've never seen a patient, and I don't know, but I think, there could be a number of reasons just out of the gate. I mean, in some ways, you'd have to think about what were specific examples and why those didn't match. But of course, there are things like the trial populations are a bit different than sort of who we see in the real world. And again, I'm going to talk a bit later in the talk about real world data and why that can be important, especially for PRO, because I think sometimes selectivity, and this could affect PRO in trials, may result in something a bit different. Oftentimes, having non-comparable instruments has really crippled us in this sense, where you have within a single clinical indication, use of different measures, and then you can't look right across. Whereas in these trials, even if they're slightly different versions of the FIXI, you could actually pick out a set of questions that were the same and say, well, how do these scores? But I think you're talking about something a bit different than that, Brian, which is that actually just, the results that you see in trials don't actually match what you think, most people experience. And so I'd love to hear more about what you think is driving that.
I don't know.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
mean, I think it has to do with, timing of assessments is not the
yep,
same. And,
yep.
obviously completion rates, and there's all sorts of things. And to me, there's enough of those things that I think it's really hard to compare. I think, again, response rate, PFS, although they certainly have their limitations in comparison, to me are more concrete. And maybe that's just my bias because of, what I do, right?
Yeah.
But quality of life data, I think it's really hard to say, well, quality of life with regimen A is better than quality of life with regimen B, even if the measures are about the same and the timing. I don't know. For me, it's always been hard to compare, and I'm just sort of putting it out there, wondering why.
No, timing is tough, and you lose people in trials as they go on, and so for that reason, I think, especially from FDA perspective, there's sort of been an onus on capturing early assessment, so you can sort of try to address the bias that comes when you look at people's experience further on, and mostly the people you have left for the trial are people who are doing better, because the people who had withdrawn for all the reasons. Whereas with a survival endpoint, at least overall survival, you can figure that out. They don't have to still be in the trial to sort of get that endpoint for them, right? So that's certainly one thing. And the timing is, as you say, you put onus as the reportable one, or the one that we look at most, is quite early in the trial, but that doesn't represent very well what's happening further out, which may be more relevant to what you're doing in clinic, is not just what's happening in the first 3 months or 6 months.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. I just, I don't know that there's an answer. It's just sort of an observation from the clinical side.
I think too. So one thing I'll say is about you didn't when I showed what the FDA looks at and what they're interested in terms of the concepts, you did not see overall quality of life there. So you did not see an overall
Yeah.
how am I doing? And so they're really looking to say we want to be able to draw as clean and proximal line from disease to a symptom or disease to a side effect or treatment to a side effect rather as we can because um, you know, there are so many things when you look at sort of a broader quality of life, like something like the EQ5D, or even I would say, broader, you could even say the fact G was an example of this, where you have all these things that are going on in people's lives that could be affected by stuff that doesn't have to do with the treatment or their disease, and there are particularities of their individual experience. I think what FDA is trying to do is minimize that and say, well, let's just really we're going to have patients report stuff, but let that be about stuff that we really can tie closely to a disease or a treatment to sort of reduce some of that confounding. And so,
Yeah.
I don't know if that would match, but I have that bias myself where I see, look, there's loads of places in medicine where measuring overall quality of life is good. I say in the context of it. Now, I will say the European perspective from this is quite different. So EMA and others, they want to see that real broad element of how's he doing, how you doing overall, But FDA, I think, has tried to say that's harder to do from a regulatory standpoint.
Yeah. I mean, last comment, and I don't want to derail your whole talk, but
No, no.
it's interesting what patients really care about, I think, is sort of overall. An example, a
Yeah,
grade 2 diarrhea to one patient, hey, no big deal, doc, I'm managing it. I got Imodium, they're doing their thing. Whereas to another patient, it's devastating for X, Y, and Z reasons. So,
that's
you
right.
know, that one symptom has different importance and effects on overall quality. So I'd probably would lean more towards the European side, understanding all the confounders of overall quality of life, right, that have nothing to do with drug or disease. So
Yeah,
anyway,
that's
thanks
very
for that.
true.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, no, then that's, I mean, my primary work with FDA, but my primary orientation being in the UK now is we're not in the EU anymore, but we look a lot, work with EMA. So I mean, this is very much
Right.
in my life, and I sort of raised in this American system, but I do see, as you say, it's like that the reason that the grade 2 diarrhea may or may not be devastating to one has to do with your work, has to do with your childcare responsibilities,
Yep.
has to do with all these things, right? And so
Yeah.
that's really what patients care about. I'm full agreement with you on that. Okay, cool, great, great, and that's thanks for bringing that up because I think that's ultimately more useful than sometimes just going through the slides in some ways. So let me talk a little bit about this kind of movement to assess adverse events from a patient's perspective. And so I'll skip over this a bit because I think we all know what treatment tolerability is in a broad way. In a standard kind of International Conference on Harmonization (ICH) definition, tolerability is the degree to which the adverse effects can be tolerated by the subject. I don't find that particularly informative, although you see what they're working with here. And they're talking about things like diseases, signs, and symptoms. If anybody on the call, and probably everybody on the call is working in trials, you know what this is. You're working with patients on a day-to-day basis, you know what this is. There's been a kind of a movement, I would say, over the past 5 years or more, a little bit, to say not again to replace any of that stuff, especially for the point of view of safety, but can we also learn from the patient about how tolerable a drug is? And so this particular publication, which is not in a peer-reviewed journal, it's just in a white paper from the Friends of Cancer Research, has been somewhat instrumental in offering an alternative definition of tolerability that really underscores, where side effects are symptomatic, we should have a input from the patient. And some of you may know Ethan Bash for at least he is an oncologist in this group, although he's also but this had patient representatives, this had regulators, this had others involved as well. And they kind of put together this schematic to say, okay, we have standard assessment of tolerability, which has things like CTCAE, dose mods and discontinuations, interruptions, et cetera. But then we have all this other stuff over here around PROs that could be useful to understanding tolerability. And so I've focused quite a bit on this, I would say, over the past 3 or 4 years. The NCI has convened and funded a tolerability consortium. I was involved looking at, in one of the projects that was funded by this, And we really looked at this overall side effect impact, and how could you do that in the context of trials. I think I mentioned this. So at least from a U.S. perspective, and I think internationally this is shared as well, there's been clear delineation between safety and what that means in terms of medical risk, how you report it and all that stuff, and tolerability. And they've really wanted to separate those out. Again, this set of core concepts that the FDA published, you'll notice only one of these disease-related symptoms is not at least indirectly, but often directly focused on tolerability, symptomatic adverse events and overall side effect summary. Those are direct measures. And then indirectly, you could argue in some cases physical function and as well as role function can be reflections of tolerability as well. So FDA cares a lot about this. Here's that question from the FACT system I talked about recently. I'm bothered by side effects of treatment. It comes from the FACT, or the FACET, it's the same thing, system. There are other ways to get at this too. The RCC system has a question just like this. There's loads of validation data on this. It's often broken up to get at people who are really sort of bothered or maybe not tolerating by sort of separating in terms of quite a bit and very much, and then these bottom three categories, people will say they're not at all, a little bit, or somewhat. That's been done to date. That may not be something that is always done in future. We did a paper, this is not in RCC, but in multiple myeloma, where we looked at how well does that question, and then separating that question into those two groups, predict early treatment discontinuation in an induction setting from an ECOG-ACRIN trial. By the way, you don't have to get lost in this, but this is just, it's called a Sankey plot. And what you have is a bunch of bar charts over assessment time points. And so on the x-axis, you have a baseline in 1 month, around 3, and about 5.5 months. Then you have a percentage of patients reporting each of these categories on the GP5 item. And so here at baseline, and then you have these bands that kind of attempt to show how they move between those between those responses across the time points. And so I've analyzed loads of trial data with this question in it, and I can tell you that many of them look quite a bit like this, where at baseline almost everybody says they are not at all bothered. You may be asking, well, why wouldn't everyone say they're not at all bothered? And we've looked into that, and I don't want to get derailed on that, but there are some reasons why, and it might be a limitation that people would say depending on the need. But then very quickly, once they go on treatment, it kind of breaks up where people start saying they get a little bit bothered and somewhat bothered. In a smaller proportion, these top two darkest bars within each stacked bar chart here reflect those who are. So you can see that actually, and this kind of is an experience that can be observed across a number of different drugs and types of cancer, et cetera, where you get that initial first toxicity hit, and then you get sort of, even though people move within these bands are not as thick as they are in terms of everybody moving out of this being not at all bothered at the baseline. And so just to kind of, as an overview, even adjusted, the odds of a subsequent treatment discontinuation, if you report being high, that is, again, saying I'm very much or quite a bit bothered after these post-baseline time points of discontinuing due to AE, using and we determine that using the off-study form as they're coded, at each of these time points was in between about 2 and 4.5 times higher for people who reported that high bother. So that's just, if you said it 1 month, I'm bothered, what was the likelihood of you after that discontinuing treatment due to AE? And we tried some other ways to operationalize that question, looking at a maximum self-report of side effect bother, sometimes the way that adverse events are looked at maximum, and nothing really looked as strong as just sort of whether or not you say you're really quite bothered. And so that stands to reason, and this has been corroborated in some analysis that will be published soon of a handful of other trials across different disease areas. Applying this in trials, so this is some of the funded work from FDA I mentioned, where we looked at, well, how would you really use this as an endpoint in trials? And we published I don't want to get lost in the statistical detail, but an estimand is a framework for coming up with an endpoint where you sort of identify an objective and who the population you're analyzing is and what's the variable and all that stuff. And so we did this with this GP5 question and overall side effect bother. So where you would want to look at the time or number of cycles patients who benefit from treatment, so still on treatment at a given predetermined cycle, spend in that high bother category. You'd use the GP5 to do that. And then you'd really only look at people at any one particular analysis up to on treatment. And this gets at this question again of you want to understand how many people who are still benefiting from treatment are sort of tolerating that treatment poorly. And you could probably do this descriptively. This was used in a thyroid cancer trial of Revetmo, so that's cabozantinib or vintetinib. In last year, FDA employed this, so comparing Revetmo, which is the product here, to one of these two in a thyroid cancer. And they did this quite descriptively, but they looked at the same question, and they looked at the mean proportion of time with that high side effect bother on each of the treatments. And you can see this is more like an adverse event analysis. There's no statistical comparison here, but they did sort of one of the things we worked on and talked to them about during that project, and they were able to get at least a descriptive read. I don't know, Brian, if you would maybe push back about, maybe you're not working in thyroid cancer, so it wouldn't come up. But this would be the kind of thing would be very interesting to hear if you say, well, that's not so much what I'm seeing as people are sort of saying they're really bothered by, something in practice as opposed to the way it looks in trial. But anyway, this is just an example. There have been other labels coming out like this as well, but it's meant to guide decision making around these things. Anyhow, so okay, moving along. So that's all within a trial. Now what I want to do is talk a little bit about the emergence of PROs and real-world evidence generation. And so we know limitations of trials. They're selective. They sort of pre-program time points for evaluation of a drug that may not match up very well with what we want to do, or really how we're prioritizing check-ins in clinic. And there's a number of things that people don't participate in trials in the same way they participate or just come see care, and so there's a number of things that we would want probably some additional read on in terms of real world evidence to help support evidence collected in trials, and that applies to all sorts of evidence, not just PRO evidence. But the group I work with now in Birmingham has been working quite a bit on generating, how would you do that if you wanted to collect data in the real world setting that could then be leveraged for regulatory decision making. And they've published standards around that, and that's all been based on a good deal of systematic review and consensus work. So, I think this is very likely to be used at some stage in post-authorization studies. In oncology, I would say is probably one of the areas where it's going to be first or most important. But there hasn't been a great deal of, until sort of quite recently, focus or even guidance from regulators on how best to do this. So we've had some sort of nods from regulators saying, well, this would be important, but there's not great guidance so far, similar to some of the other guidance I've showed you earlier from FDA. In general, what collecting data in the real world environment would mean would be, pragmatic studies, registries, retrospective data analyses, observational studies, but primarily, or I shouldn't say primarily, but critically, data collected in routine clinical care, data from actual, practice. And so that's an area I have a great deal of interest in, and I think, it's going to be important that we figure out how to include PROs in routine clinical care, not just for the purpose, and maybe even not primarily for the purpose of generating data that ultimately regulators would consume, but that actually could be used to guide patient care. So, as I mentioned, regulators, particularly FDA, but also EMA and MHRA, where I am in the UK, and others, really have begun to point to, but not offered guidance around, the use of PROs in routine clinical care and in real-world settings, I should say. And I think, especially if you buy this idea that there is something to learn from patients about adverse events. Long-term monitoring of, say, advanced therapies like CAR T, it's probably going to be required to do it in a setting like this, at least to some degree. So I'm involved in the ISPOR PRO and Prospective Real-World Study Design Task Force. We're getting ready to publish some recommendations, but the goal of this group is to enhance the robustness and transparency of real-world PRO data research. Describing its value, highlighting emerging good practices, as well as making represented recommendations. And this has been presented in conferences, and there's a publication that should be coming out quite soon. This has been a great group that has included not just PRO researchers, but regulators and folks from industry and people from really across the board. We've looked at a good deal of gleaning what we can from disparate guidances to piece together sort of what could be focused on. And that has included both the guidance on real-world evidence as well as specific guidance on PROs. And now what we hope to do is lead to something that actually combines both of those. Okay, so now thinking about, where would you actually get those real-world data? I think we're increasingly seeing that electronic PRO data, but it could be done in paper as well, can efficiently capture PROs, especially around symptomatic adverse events. In routine clinical care, there's been significant focus on this recently. The Proteus Consortium has published guidance on how to implement PROs in routine clinical care. When I was here at Northwestern, we've had PROs collected in some oncology clinics for quite some time now, and expanded that while I was here as well. Medical record providers like Epic especially have embedded modules for PROs, we've constantly sort of figuring out how to do this in a way that is actually meaningful for patients, that is, but hopefully can save time for clinicians by electronically capturing what's going on with the patient while they're at home, and then either using that in the clinical setting or the visit actually to discuss what's happening with the patient, but also potentially prioritizing who needs to come in earlier or is in most need. Some of this has gotten traction due to a series of trials that have happened in the recent history, but one led by Ethan Bosch, but a whole group of folks implemented PRO monitoring in routine care and saw a clinic level survival benefit, and that's because they used PROs and then tied that to a clear symptom management pathway facilitated by nurses. A lot of this was around adverse event to drug, and they could, if something was really going wrong with someone, they could pick that up, sort of quickly get that into a care pathway, and then respond to that. And then, at least in this case, subsequent trials have not found, one subsequent trial in lung cancer in France did see this survival benefit as well. A more recent one, what's called the PROTECT trial, did not, but it did reduce hospitalizations. And so, it looks like there's some benefit to this. In our group, there's been a good deal of work on generation of a system to capture the impacts and potential side effects of CAR T. CAR T is obviously emerging, maybe not so much in RCC, but certainly in hematologic malignancies. And so we've focused on generating, as I say, a PRO system that can really capture the impacts and help assist with the management of patients who are on CAR T in a real world, real clinical practice setting. So of course there are challenges in doing this where, if you're looking at patients on different types of treatment, how do you select the PROs that are going to actually capture the side effects that they have? increasingly there are devices. We need to pay attention to what's the right assessment timing and frequency that makes sense for clinical decision making, and can that be aligned with regulatory needs around real world evidence. There's sort of need to sort of leverage for regulators the ability to demonstrate data provenance, sort of figuring out if someone's filled out a PRO at home, are they really the one that did it, or was it a carer or someone else? There's inevitably going to be a lot of missing data here. How do you handle that? And are the approach is going to be robust? And so that's all ongoing work. To wrap this up and take home, I do think, and a lot of my work is on sort of pushing out there the argument that patient centricity is really important in the evaluation of new treatments, efficacy, but really intolerability as well. And I think oncology and renal cell carcinoma in particular are places where that's been quite important. We do have rigorous methodological frameworks to do that, especially around understanding experience of adverse events and trials. And we are learning quickly how to do that in the real world setting again, is not just for the purpose of regulatory consumption, but really help create some efficiencies in routine patient management. So I'll stop there and just look forward to some discussion.
All right, Devin, thanks. That was amazing. Your time and expertise again. I'll open it up if anybody has questions. I can start. One of the things, sort of to go backwards maybe a little bit, is when I did I think I commented at a meeting once on some quality of life data. So I just sort of go back and look at a lot of the primary data. And you didn't talk about this, but there's these clinically meaningful thresholds that are defined for each one that seemed, as I went back to look, like to be relatively completely arbitrary and based on something that either I didn't understand or didn't think was important. Can you talk about that a little bit? How they don't seem like they change. And a lot of times we'll see differences between drug A and drug B, but neither of them meet clinically significant. So you're not really sure how to interpret it.
Yeah, I can talk about that. It's one of the methodological areas I focus on, and I think it's one of the things we're not that great at. And in some ways, because I think we've tried to be almost too scientific about it, and I'll say what I mean by that, but they can be arbitrary in some senses. And so in general, there's a couple ways those are demonstrated or identified, I should say. One is you do a study where you have an anchor measure, and an anchor measure would just be some other measure, hopefully more conceptually clear. Say something like a patient-reported ECOG-ACRIN performance status measure that breaks people down into sort of these sort of really conceptually clear, distinct clinical categories. And then you look at your PRO and you try to say, well, what's the difference in change between people who said that they themselves were in those categories? And then you use that to inform a threshold. And then you can say, oh, that's great. That seems to sort of be logical, it's sort of. But then you have questions about, well, how do those really apply across trials and across populations? And can you really just have one for each instrument? And importantly, sometimes those wind up being very, very small. And then you go, well, okay, maybe your anchor analysis said that, this is what the threshold is, but a lot of people are going to meet that, and it's hard to differentiate from just statistical error or measurement error. And so you go, okay, well, we need something higher. And then so you begin to look at, have you exceeded measurement error at least? It's a tough one, and I think it's one where we actually need to swing a bit back more to the way that we get a lot of clinical expertise in and go to the methods that clinicians use to decide, well, what's a reasonable difference between groups and overall survival to indicate a treatment benefit here? Because I don't think that the way that we do it currently leads to a very rational set of, because right now what you have is you'll get different thresholds for the same instrument on similar populations as artifacts of studies. Sometimes people can kind of use them to game a thing a bit where they say, well, okay, this fell under the threshold, so it's not meaningful when it potentially could be. Even if there's a statistically significant difference, or, usually if there's huge differences, we say, well, that's a little bit easier to interpret. But But yeah, I think that's one, and the FDA's tried to guide in this, and I don't know if that's improved the scenario or not yet. We'll have to see. But yeah, I would say those should always be taken with a grain of salt, should be treated with caution. Sensitivity analyses should be done, and you should be looking at them in the combination of, well, what else do we know about the benefit? Does it sort of follow that? And just because say someone in a paper once said it was 4 points, and then really it's been 3.2 points or something like that. That should not be sort of discounted. It's the way I think that. Yeah.
I think what happens is, when these are presented to a predominantly clinical audience, people like myself and us, and don't have high level expertise in this, you kind of take it at face value because you don't have enough knowledge base to say, oh, maybe it is important or maybe it isn't, or all the nuances you just mentioned. And so people just look at the bottom line. Oh, there wasn't a difference, or there was a difference, and they're not as discerning, or critical as maybe they should be, simply because they don't have the knowledge base, to do that.
Yeah. It's a bit, and I'm not saying p-values aren't important. They obviously are, but I think sometimes in medicine, we can put so much onus on a number.
Sure.
And then we go, well, if it didn't happen, then, we got to have these guidelines. I'm not saying we don't, but
Yeah,
I think this is one where we really need to be critical interpreters of the evidence that we see, and hope for some instruments, say, I would say, for instance, where you have a lot of experience in trials, like it would be more useful now to go back and look at FIXI across a bunch of trials in the RCC setting with different drugs and say, what can we learn with that to inform new trial design than the way this gets done most of the time? Like that, this is, renal cell carcinoma is actually a place where there might be a chance to learn a lot and sort of have a much better picture of what could be meaningful to people. And then there's new methods emerging where you try to figure out with actually, like in more of a qualitative setting, and say, look, in general, this is what we think, a 5-point change indicates. That can be different by individuals, or this is what a 10-point change would mean, and talk to people and say, what would that be important to you, or what kind of change would be important to you, and try to anchor on to that a little bit better as well. Which, again, I think we always we sometimes in the quantitative part lose sight of what people really tell us, and I think we need to bring that in a bit more as well.
Great, thanks. Anybody else? Questions?
This is Ritesh. Just quick question. This is a great presentation. Something that's kind of under, I guess it's hard for us to think about this much more on the clinical side. But what is your impression in terms of like the current technologies that we can utilize? Like many of us have seen studies of like Apple Watches as like a reflection of performance status, and steps as reflection. But I feel like we're getting to a day and age where a lot of these things are kind of there are other surrogates that we can monitor for, and it's almost like underutilized data that, as long as we can kind of standardize how it's collected and standardize, maybe as Brian's mentioning, almost like the instrument, then we can kind of get towards actually doing like very, very large, almost like population-based studies with great numbers of patients with like technology that almost exists that people have.
Yeah, that's right. And that's emerging. And, there's the Digital Medicine Society, for one, is looking at, you can get a lot of data about people, as they walk around and as they sleep and what their heart does during the day and things like that. And it's increasingly good data. I think when it started out, it was quite erroneous, or at least it had high, margins of error. But now it's getting better. And I think the doing what you said, the technology is improving, and I think we all can agree that probably it will keep improving. And we're not going to have to push that along. The companies are going to do it for us. But, I think as long as we can map that back to understanding what is going to be meaningful to people, and that includes clinicians, and then coming up with some agreement between patients and clinicians on, when these changes happen, that indicates something that's generally good or generally bad, or I'm doing well on treatment or I'm not doing well on treatment. Getting that stuff figured out, I think there will be increasing opportunities. And I think that there are ways to do patient report in more of a sort of as you go about your daily life type of setting as well. So, like we have these structured questionnaires. They're fantastic. I don't think we want to lose sight of those. But, what can you do with, a much smaller set of questions that someone could maybe answer on an Apple Watch or a phone, a little bit more frequently that could then be used, to collect data that really get at what's going on with that person more intensively over time. But at any one time, you don't ask them a zillion things. You just sort of, and then you pair that with, to me, all of this stuff is, in an ecosystem of being able to learn about people in ways that are less burdensome to them, but then give us a lot of important information to evaluate new drugs. And so I think there's increasing opportunities for that, and people are working on it really hard.
Thanks. A couple minutes left. Anybody else? Questions?
I think, Brian, this came up at
Okay.
like one of the KCR's meetings at some point in terms of like, Q twist and whatnot. But is there a sense from like, just like when you think about now the newer registration studies and whatnot, is there a sense of just how much this is being looked at from regulatory authorities, PROs and stuff? Or
I mean, Oncology Center of Excellence at FDA would be an example where I'm aware of that they do ask for it, and they've gone so far as to ask sponsors to give them their data, and then they do additional analyses and try to provide more insight around it. I think what we've learned is that there's opportunity to get opportunity for approvals. There's opportunity, maybe much more in labels than approvals, probably less, approvals are going to be less so on PRO alone specifically, but maybe in some cases. But they are asking for it a lot, and I think, and as I say, OCE is in particular been driving this forward, and so I think they're ones who they have great. So not every review division is equally at FDA is equally good at interpreting PRO data. Oncology Center of Excellence is quite good at it.
Yeah.
Quite good at it. Yeah.
just because I feel like it's always like in hindsight that we kind of think about the PRO aspect. Obviously, everyone's so focused on, trying to measure at least like, attributed toxicities in the response data. And it doesn't seem like it's almost taken into account to some degree, but it is like an extra burden on patients to really fill out many of these PRO type questionnaires and whatnot when they're coming in already.
It can be, especially if they're not leveraged well. And so
Right.
I think, there was some recent publication that Johnson & Johnson did, and then this would include Janssen data, where they looked at something like 120 trials, and it wound up being cumulatively over 1 million PRO records, and people spent like 2 minutes on average filling up PROs. And so what we know from patients themselves and others, it's not cheap, by the way, but is that if they think it's going to matter, people are willing to do it. But if it's going to get it's a very side thing, then it's almost like you got to really weigh how important is that. And so, I would say, going back to something Ryan said quite early on, the earlier you can build in and have the PRO be something that actually is well taken care of in the trial, the more likely it is to be informative and useful. I think we do come from a history where it's been like, oh yeah, just put that in there, and then it's harder to learn from at that stage.
Understood. Thanks.
Well, thanks, Devin. This has been amazing. Great topic for us. Appreciate again your time and expertise. Hope to see you soon. And thanks everyone for joining.
Yeah, really my pleasure. Take care, everybody. Have a good rest of
See
your
you
day.
again. Thanks
Cheers.
all.
Thank you.
Thank you.